Hi, my name is Gary Hauck. I'm the Dean Emeritus of Arts and Sciences at Montcalm Community College and an avid reader and have been for years. So I'm glad to talk today about one of the very interesting folks of Montcalm County, Bert Silver. I'm also on the board at the museum in Greenville that houses a replica of the Silver Theater. And so I've learned a few things about this delightful gentleman over the years. Bert was born in 1861 in New York City to parents in showbiz. His dad was called the Minstrel Man. He played a banjo and played a violin. He would sing and dance. And so Bert learned all those skills at a very young age from his father, Dick. He also learned to play cornet at a very early age. And so he became a little tiny showbiz person from the get-go. They moved here to Montcalm County. And in 1895, when we first had the first movie theater in the world in Paris, that was created by the Lumiere brothers, Auguste and Louis. Of course, the word of that traveled to the States, and Bert had the interest from the get-go of someday having his own theater. About 1905 or 1906 is when he had his eyes set on getting a theater. But he started out, first of all, founding a circus. It was the Bert Silver Circus. They had their headquarters in Crystal, on the little mound where the park now is, overlooking the lake. That's where they had their headquarters. And his circus was the first mobilized circus in the United States. They had 4 trucks, 2 of which were made in Greenville. They had 4 cars, and they would move from place to place with their acrobats and magicians and jugglers and their animals, and it was quite a sensation. And the entire family would get into the act with their musical instruments, their banjos and their violins and their trumpets and all of that. So it was quite the show. In 1909, Bert decided to also buy a theater. He bought a theater on Lafayette Street in Greenville, and there he would show some of the short movies, because back in those early days, there were black and white movies only. They were 50 seconds long for the most part. They would show several at one time of a baby eating or of a boat arriving or a train arriving and those kinds of things. But they would say that for 10 cents you would get 3 rolls of film, you would get 2 vaudeville acts, and also get a free live band. So they had their wonderful Saturday shows in the theater for several years, and that became quite the hit. In 1915, he purchased the old Phelps Opera House in Greenville. And his mental image was to make that a theater for both live acts, music, and also films. And that was also a monumental year in the States. It was the first year that the full 1-hour movies rolled out. And of course, D.W. Griffith had his great American classic on the American legacy, the American story at that time as well, Story of a Nation. So that was a real hallmark year and kind of kicked off this national phenomenon of movie houses across the country. I think the first movie house in the United States was in Pittsburgh, called the Nickelodeon, in the year 1905. So he was riding on the coattails of this wonderful movement of these indoor silent movie houses all across the country. So in 1915, when he purchased this theater and turned it into a movie house and also a live band performance center and a vaudeville act, he also kept going the circus. However, in 1916, the circus, the trucks and cars were all confiscated for the war effort by Uncle Sam. And so the circus disappeared, and the theater now became his main focus. And so from those years on, we had the Silver Family Concert Band, who would perform every Saturday afternoon to applauding audiences before they had their wonderful movie theaters. So that continued on. The 1920s, his daughters, I think they were Ruby and Laura, became more of the musicians in the forefront and also helped to manage the theater. And by 1935, they redecorated it in the Art Deco style and made it into a more fancy theater in the process. And I'll also mention around that time, you have movies now evolving significantly. In 1927, you have sound movies, and by 1930, you had movies in color. So when you think of sound, you think of The Jazz Singer as one of the great early classics. And for the colored films, Cecil B. DeMille's Greatest Story was one of the first ones that came out in color. And so Burt was kind of on the cutting edge for these movements. So when sound came out, sound came to his theater. When color came out, color came to his theater. I'm told his favorite all-time movie was Top Hat with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, one that my wife and I still enjoy watching to this day. He loved that because he loved wearing a top hat. And he often wore his top hat in honor of Fred Astaire and tried to even dance like Fred Astaire, although we're told I kind of brought some chuckles when he tried to do that. But what a delightful man. I feel like I know him, even though I never met him, obviously, but what a great man to have known during that time period. The theater was sold by him, I think in 1936 or 1939, somewhere around in there, to the Butterfield Company. And so the Butterfield Company took it over, but they told him that for as long as he lives, there will always be a free seat in the house for him. And so he made use of that till the end of his years here in the Greenville area. And I'll also say that the theater continued on until 1986 and was not torn down until 1988, and today it's a parking lot. But there is the Silver Theater in the Flat River Historical Museum in Greenville. So if you get a chance to come there sometime and to see it, it does have some of the wonderful artifacts from the actual theater to bring back those days. So when I think of Bert Silver, I think of a wonderful, colorful man who gave us so much and who capitalized on this booming industry of the movies. So a word about literature. I've always been in love with books. In fact, one of the courses I've taught at MCC has been called Great Books, where we study some of the great books of literature. And this year I've read several books already and enjoyed them, one of which was by Tammy Jo Schultz, Nerves of Steel, a life story of the Southwest airline pilot, a woman pilot, who brought the plane safely down into a landing after it had an explosion in the air, and one person was killed in the process of the explosion. And she was able to very quietly and calmly and expertly bring that plane to the ground and minimize the chaos on board that plane. And so this book describes the making of her character, her personality, and how she was able to have such great control in the process, and how her training in the military also helped her for that time period. And I'll confess that until I read that book, whenever I would hear a woman pilot in the cockpit, my heart would beat a little bit. But now that I read that book, I feel even more safe with a woman pilot than I do a male pilot. So it's a great book to read. My wife and I also read the biography of John Quincy Adams, and what a delightful story about him and also about his lovely wife and the impact they had both in Europe and here in the States as they served as ambassadors, and then of course with what role we know they had here as president and president's wife. So a very powerful book. Those are among the ones that come to my mind off the hat, but I love to read. I must confess that I normally go to nonfiction, although I read some fiction books in the last few weeks as well, some that are based on early man and what life was like, and kind of a fantasy of some fictional stories within the early human race and how life would have been at that time. So I heartily recommend it. Make reading a part of your daily and your weekly experience. Thanks.